Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our discussion today. Today we want to look at the question of education in a society that ever more emphasizes the connection between people through media, through social media. It's a phenomenon that we're all familiar with. We're lucky enough today here at the New York Encounter to have with us two journalists from two of the most important newspapers here in New York and in the nation. Gentlemen who have written about education, thought about the question of the online generation, and who bring their own personal experience to our discussion today. And so, I introduce first Mr. Ross Douthat, who in April 2009 became the youngest op-ed columnist in the history of the New York Times. He was a senior editor at The Atlantic and is the author of Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. He is co-author with Reihan Salam of the Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. A film critic for the National Review, Douthat has also contributed to the New York Times, the Weekly Standard, Policy Review, Details, the Claremont Review of Books, GQ, Slate, and other publications. To my left is Mr. Matthew KAMINSKI. He's a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board in New York, a post he took up in July of 2008. For the previous 3 years, Mr. KAMINSKI was the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal Europe, based in Paris. He joined the journal in 1997 as a reporter in Brussels and specialized in security issues, Central Europe, and the Balkans. And so if I could ask you to welcome our guests today. So, both of you have written about the question of education and the online generation. Mr. Douthat, you have written about your educational experience at Harvard, both in your book, just mentioned, Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class, and in The Atlantic, and your opinion piece in the New York Times about the fall of U.S. Congressman Anthony Weiner looked at the narcissism that animates relationships online. And Mr. KAMINSKI, just in October, you wrote extensively about school reform in New Orleans. And certainly you have much experience in your own position with the means of constant communication that we all rely upon and by which we are all ever more solicited and engaged. I'd like to first begin by considering the question of education. This, what you're participating in today, the New York Encounter, arises from a social reality, a movement begun in the Catholic Church by an Italian Monsignor, Luigi Giussani. He was an educator. First he was a high school religion teacher, and then he went to the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, and he wrote extensively on the topic of education. In his most important collection of writings, entitled The Risk of Education, he wrote, according to the Jesuit theologian Joseph Jungmann, education is an introduction to reality. The word reality is to the word education, like destination is to a journey. Reality defines and structures each step of the educational journey and is at the same time its final destination, its achievement. Jungmann qualifies his definition thus: education is an introduction to total reality. Clearly then, Giussani continues, the value of an education is measured by how closely and obediently it follows reality, how much attention it calls to it, and how closely it follows even its faintest indications. He finishes this little piece by saying, we can qualify this sort of pedagogical realism as follows. We truly affirm reality only when we affirm the existence of its meaning. A total meaning of reality is the underpinning of the educational process. So, as we just heard, Gisani locates the heart of education in the attempt to introduce a person to reality and, most importantly, to its meaning. Back in 2007, the Yale law professor Anthony Kronman made a related affirmation in his work on American higher education entitled Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. He wrote, "I've watched the question of life's meaning lose its status as a subject of organized academic instruction, and seen it pushed to the margins of professional respectability in the humanities, where it once occupied a central and honored place. In my time as a teacher and dean, I've seen this question exiled from the humanities, first as a result of the growing authority of the modern research ideal, and then on account of the culture of political correctness that has undermined the legitimacy of the question itself and the authority of humanities teachers to ask it." So, in a time when discussions about education and its reform seem to be framed strictly in terms of results, or I can tell you from the point of view of an educator myself, evermore the new word is outcomes. Whether those results be measured or outcomes be measured in test scores or the ability to offer upward mobility or to fashion internationally competitive workers, choose your measure. In your opinion, right now in America, can the question of reality and its meaning add something to the discussion about education?
Well, let's see you, Matthew. The easier answer is obviously no. Of course it can. So, and we can just leave it there. No, that's a tremendously rich set of questions. I guess I'd make a couple comments. One is that I think if you look at the experience of education in what the professor you quoted is talking about, the modern research university, right, which is the place where the bulk of the American upper class is sort of nurtured and educated these days. I think there's no question whatsoever that there is a kind of persistent and near permanent crisis of confidence in the humanities in particular about education's ability to deliver on that promise of opening up access to some kind of, if not total reality, even a partial reality. And I think one of the striking things about the elite academy today is the gulf in confidence between the sciences and between the humanities, with the sort of quasi-sciences, economics in particular, sort of occupying this sort of ambiguous space in between. But I think a tremendous amount of effort has been expended by academics in that quasi-scientific zone to sort of lift their feet and move themselves into the scientific zone, because that's where, I mean, the idea, you know, economics as a discipline has always sort of had one foot in the humanities and one foot in the sciences. And I think what you've seen, especially over the last few decades, is the fact that the sciences in American life successfully present themselves as, you know, as a place where you can find reality, where you can find sort of hard facts and so on. And the humanities have, you know, for a variety of reasons, you know, having a lot to do with sort of cultural relativism in the broadest sense, a sort of, you know, a desire not to give offense, the sort of skepticism that's inherent in postmodernism and so on. You know, there are a lot of reasons why the humanities don't feel confident one, in saying, well, we can, deliver some sort of total reality. Two, just in saying, well, we can distinguish between what is important and what's not, right? I mean, one of the striking things about the way humanities are taught in elite institutions is the inability, with the exception of a few schools like the University of Chicago and Columbia, but the sort of baseline inability to say, well, here are some things that it's important that every educated person read, right? I mean, at my own university, at Harvard, there was a kind of core curriculum, right, that every undergraduate had to participate in. But the theory behind the core curriculum was not knowledge itself. It was what was called approaches to knowledge. So there was no particular history course you needed to take, no particular novels that you needed to read. You just needed to take some sort of course that would show you the English department's approach to knowledge, or the history department's approach to knowledge, or, the statistics profession's approach to knowledge. And I think that that's a sort of, from the point of view that education should be about truth, I think that's a deeply telling indictment of where the humanities and elite institutions have ended up, sort of saying, well, we're all approaching knowledge, we can't really get there, we can't say one kind of knowledge is more important than the other, and so on. Meanwhile, the harder sciences sort of go from strength to strength because they actually deliver, right? I mean, they deliver scientific breakthroughs, technological feats, and so on. So they're in a much stronger position. At the same time, coexisting with that sort of serious intellectual problem, you also have a broader problem that explains why there's so much interest in results, outcomes, outcome-based learning, and so on, which is that, the American educational system taken as a whole isn't delivering very well on sort of, what you might call more basic things, like delivering upward mobility, like competing with with public schools in other countries and so on. So I think it's important to be able to sort of see both sides of the story, right? To simultaneously be able to say, yes, there is a kind of crisis of meaning in American education, and it's particularly pronounced at the highest levels, and it's particularly pronounced in the humanities at the highest levels. But at the same time, I don't want to sit here and say, well, meaning is infinitely more important than sort of, making sure that grade schoolers in post-Katrina New Orleans can pass what seem like pretty basic tests of fifth grade competency, right? That stuff is important too. So I think it's, when you think, and any conversation about it, when we talk about education, we're talking about such a vast terrain, right? It's important to be able to hold different ideas in your head simultaneously and recognize that it can both be true that we need to not just focus on sort of testing and outcomes and success and careers, and that we need to think about the bigger questions, but also to recognize that there are parts of American education, higher and lower, that haven't even achieved the kind of basic level of competency you need to get to those bigger questions. And so in those areas, talking about meaning can be a way of evading more basic things like making sure that kids know how to read.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to your comments with a later question, because as an educator, it raises this question for me, which is, but why does a kid, not for society, not for his parents, but why for himself, does he need to even master those basic competency skills? But we'll come back to that. And what would you say, Mr. Kaminsky? Meaning, reality, are these terms that we can use when we're talking about educational reform in a place like New Orleans that you wrote about?
I think you're actually sort of posing very big questions, and the first one is really, what is the purpose of education? And the related one that you imply is, should our schools in some ways impart, moral values, or sort of should values be part of the educational proposition? And just thinking about this, I was thinking about, the etymology of the word education, and I actually did look it up before coming here. And it comes from...
You Googled it, right?
It took me 0.4 seconds to get the answer, but... And not surprisingly, it comes from Latin, which is one of the many lacunae in my own education, but it comes from ex ducere, so sort of out lead out someone, and that's actually what education really means, literally, is to bring up children, to lead them into the world, but also to train them. And I still think the primary fundamental function of education has to be a utilitarian one, that we are giving people the skills that they need, the mental skills and other skills to function in the world, to think about what's going on about them and find solutions. Now, this does not mean that you turn your back on these higher values, but it does, I think, to me at least, suggest a very robust defense of liberal education, classically defined. It is that you are still supposed to be asking the big questions. One of the things that I was reminded of again this weekend was there's an article in 1947 by Martin Luther King, and since it is the King long weekend, I thought it may be worth quoting. He wrote it in the Morehouse College paper, and I did find it again on Google, if you allow me. He said, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically, but education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals. If we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts." But again, I actually do read in this a defense of a classical liberal education, that it is utilitarian in the sense that we do want to produce critically thinking people, who read deeply and actively, who, starting with the Greeks all the way through. I didn't go to Harvard, so at my university they were insisting that I go through this freshman year, and we had a sort of intensive program that did sort of introduce you to this. And I found this actually to be a very important grounding, possibly the only thing that I still retain from those 4 years. And as you know, this has been a great debate in U.S. education over the canon, and maybe this is actually more of a dated debate, but my freshman year, and I went to Yale, the dean, Don Kagan, gave a speech in defense of Western civilization, which was then we spent the next 6 months of my freshman year debating, mostly criticizing him for promoting the ideas of dead white males who happen to be Greeks, which I don't think is a great recommendation these days, but anyway. In any case, I do want to finish saying that this is not a Rick Santorum kind of, cast the first stone idea that schools are meant to impart values. I actually don't, I think the school is not, the educational institution is not the place where that happens. The school is where you are trained to enter the world, and there was this great chart online in the New York Times a few days ago about the gap between the average salary of a college graduate and a high school graduate, and that gap keeps getting wider and wider. So clearly there's a utility in the sense for having an education, but there's a utility to society for having a broad education. Yet, when it comes to the issue of values that you raised from the law school dean, I actually don't think that is the role of our schools. I think that actually this is one place which is the role of the families, of the community, of the church. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. I'll come back to because again, your answer raises questions for me, which is. The first question that comes up in listening to the answers, but how do we decide what is utilitarian? I mean, it seems to me that even that is a question. In other words, what meaning do we give to the word utilitarian? In what sense utilitarian? I don't want to be philosophical, I recognize. I'm not saying that we don't have the need to impart the certain, the skills of writing, the skills of reading, the skills of math, certain skills, undoubtedly. But how do we evaluate those skills? How do we evaluate which are more important? if science is the only thing that allows us to touch reality, well, at that point, how useful are the humanities? And I think that this is one of the questions that's there. But to go back to Mr. Douthat, I'm sorry to say that I haven't read your book, Privilege, Harvard, and the Education of the Ruling Class.
Oversight on your part.
But I keep saying the title so that we can all go out and buy it. But I did read your article in The Atlantic that touched upon its topic, and there you wrote about your experience as a Harvard undergraduate and the question of grade inflation. And in that article in The Atlantic, you wrote, the students' ambitions are those of a well-trained, meritocratic elite. In the semi-aristocracy that Harvard once was, students could accept C's because they knew their prospects in life had more to do with family fortunes and connections than with GPAs. In today's meritocracy, the situation no longer obtains. Even if you could live off your parents' wealth, the ethos of the meritocracy holds that you shouldn't, because your worth as a person is determined not by clan or class, but by what you do and whether you succeed at it. What you do, in turn, hinges in no small part on what is on your resume, including your GPA. It was easy to see the classroom as just another resume-padding opportunity, a place to collect the grade and recommendation necessary to get to the next station in life. If that grade could be obtained while reading 1/10 of the books on the syllabus, so much the better. That's the end of your quote. What interested me in this piece is the question of education's reason for existence, as you presented here, at least for some, as being jumping through a hoop to get to the next station in life. Doesn't that assumption guide much of America's educational attempts today? And if so, should this assumption be challenged?
Yes and yes. I think it both does guide much of America's education system today, and it should be challenged again to sort of, I mean, this will return us to sort of the question of sort of utility and so on, but I think it deserves to be challenged more at the elite level, perhaps, than it does at the secondary level and so on, because I think that there, you know, in the most basic sense, you know, there is a sense in which an educational system does need to supply a series of hoops for people to jump through and so on, and your goal is to get people to jump through enough of them that they can make something of themselves in life. I think it becomes more of a problem. You know, once a certain minimum standard has been obtained, and you enter a world where sort of hoops jumping becomes an end unto itself. I mean, I think it's sort of, you know, I don't worry about the sort of professional fates of people who go to schools like Harvard and Yale, and for that reason, the sort of the sense of careerism there, I think, is more of a problem than a sense of careerism would be at, say, you know, an inner city high school or something. But I think, I don't know how many people in the audience have seen The Social Network, the movie that came out last year about Mark Zuckerberg and the founding of Facebook, which it's a movie that sort of sits at the intersection of the topics we're discussing here today. As far as I could tell, and I'm not an expert on the founding of Facebook, but as far as I could tell, the movie's account of how Facebook came to be was almost completely bunk. It sort of, you know, almost completely fictionalized and invented motivations that Mark Zuckerberg probably didn't have and so on. But as a portrait of elite education, I think it was one of the most accurate portrayals I've ever seen on film, because I think it captured the way that schools like Harvard can become places where the point is to, you know, the point is not what you learn in the classroom, it's figuring out a way to beat the other people who you are in school with, who are your peers, but in reality your competitors. And it's sort of, again, for those of you who don't see it, the sort of the dramatic crux of the story pits Mark Zuckerberg against these two more sort of traditional Harvard guys, right? The sort of the Winklevoss twins, who are members of an elite club and, are sort of, much preppier than he is and so on. He's sort of more hard scrabble and so on. But in fact, in real life, Mark Zuckerberg is upper middle class and comes from a well-to-do family and so on. So what's being competed for is not actually sort of just the abilities to succeed in life. It's this sort of competition as an end unto itself, where even the blue bloods, in the end, in the Harvard of 1940, they wouldn't have cared what Mark Zuckerberg was doing on the internet. But in the Harvard of 2005, they were measured more by their ability to compete with him than they were by their family name. And in certain ways, obviously, that's a huge step forward, right? I mean, you don't necessarily want to live in a world where your elite is determined by blood and birth and so on, rather than by achievement. But there is a sense in which this sort of restless spirit of achievement for achievement's sake, I think, can become a big problem.
No, again, just thoughts, reactions to listening to your, because I having again experience in secondary schools, a lot of friends experience in secondary schools, and including schools that service low income and inner city students, and having worked with them at times also in my own career. The reason I'm pushing so hard on this question is because what I've seen is that when the reason for education is success, in a place like the inner city, there are other models for how to reach that success besides education. And many of those models are quicker, more exciting, and easier. And so this is why I'm pushing so hard on this. In other words, it seems to me that you cannot, and this goes beyond the question of educating people to values. That's not even my first question, or my first interest, I should say. It's just that it seems to me that the whole system is based, the entire system is based on success and on the possibility of giving people tools for success. For the person to whom that doesn't appeal,
right?
For the person to whom that isn't convincing, that's more where the question.
Well, and before Matthew jumps in, I would just say that my point, and I think you're right. I think my point was less to sort of defend the idea that inner city schools should just be holding up success for success's sake, as just to say that to push back against the idea that sort of rigorous testing, for instance, is evil or something, that metrics of success, I think a values-based framework, whether it's a Catholic school or anything else, can be, I agree, tremendously important in sort of changing the way people look at their lives. I just think within that framework, I don't want to downplay the importance of sort of basic metrics of what succeeding in school means that have to do with passing tests rather than sort of more nebulous things.
Okay. Did you want to speak to this at all? Otherwise, I've got another question heading another direction.
Just very briefly, I think sort of the issue of testing. I'm the father of kids who are in New York City public schools, first and fourth grade. So I'm very familiar with the testing pressure, which is already starting at age 7. And it's quite annoying because it actually overwhelms the educational experience, I think, besides stressing out my 7-year-old that she won't get anywhere in life. But the tests, at the same time, do tell you something. They tell you how well the kid tests. They tell you how well they can do math problems. They tell you how well they've prepared for the test. And the same thing with grades. I mean, grades basically tell you how well this person knows how to get good grades, which probably tells you how well they can do assigned tasks. But no one is imputing kind of a larger meaning to this. And it's just one of, the multiple metrics that we have to judge who we hire, how worthy is someone, how well they've done.
Excellent. No, continuing somewhat in the same direction. It seems to me that much attention has been focused on the American elite of late. The financial crisis, the resulting Great Recession, the political gridlock that we see, and what some have argued is a general American decline. All of these have been blamed by some upon a failure of the American elite. We know that much of this elite is formed by the Ivy League and a few other top-notch American universities. I personally remember that the uproar when George W. Bush nominated Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court, and the whole question that she had not received an Ivy League education, she had no Ivy credentials. How much failure in elites, in America's elite, do you see, Mr. Kaminsky? And if you see any, do you believe any of it can be traced to an educational failure on the part of the highest echelons of America's academy?
Well, I think Harriet Miers' problem was also cronyism and competence. So I think if she'd been a great nominee from the University of Texas, she'd be just fine. And I just also like to think that this idea, the idea of American decline is a great example of it's a creation of the American elite, let's say, at least of the opinion-making elite. We've been at this for many decades. Having come to this country in the 80s, I remember pictures of Helen Bentley on Capitol Hill smashing Sony TVs because Japan's going to take over us somehow the next 20 years. Worked out pretty well, and I think I think this whole American declinism is mostly a fantasy, but it's a nice thing to talk about, and it'll sell some books to some people, maybe even me. I just like this idea that I want to push back against the idea of an American elite. I spent 15 years of my adulthood living in Europe, and the idea of an elite in Europe is different than here. I think much more so than here. To be a member of the elite in Europe, you are defined by your last name, by your blood, by the way you speak, and certainly by the school you went. I think this is obviously true in the UK, although there's more mobility there than people get credit for. It's certainly true in France, where one school that graduates about 60 people per year essentially runs the country. This is the École Nationale d'Administration, and that's sort of the enarchs who do rule there. I think that's actually very different in this country, especially in the last 40 years. I mean, this is all in all a fairly meritocratic place. And even you mentioned the elite institutions. I think these institutions in the 1960s had to make a choice. Are they going to be fancy finishing schools, or are they going to be the best schools in the country? In the 1950s, someone told me that I think Gaddis Smith, this a Yale professor who's writing a history of the school, said that I think about 80% of applicants to Yale got in. Most of them were the kids of people who'd gone there. Most of them went to New England prep schools, and there were quotas on Jews, shamefully. And there was a decision made in the 60s that either the school opens up or it'll itself go into decline. And just an interesting aside that George W. Bush, who graduated I think in 68 or 67, has a very ambivalent relationship with the school, because he was there. He came as one of these people from Andover, a fancy prep school, at a time when the school was transforming into a much more open place. I think now more than 2/3 of the kids there are from public schools. Alumni kids certainly don't dominate, and it is in schools' interest actually to bring in kids who are not alumni kids, to engender this kind of new sort of loyalty in groups. I think this is true of American society as a whole. I think these schools, in a way, reflect the society. You get in because you get good grades in high school and you test well, and there's always this argument, are Harvard students good because they went to Harvard, or are they good students who happen to go to Harvard and would have done, very well going to any number of other schools? And I think probably the latter is true. And I think this is generally true of, I think the American establishment, it's always, what is the establishment? Well, whatever it is, it's very fluid. The barriers to entry are relatively low, and it has an incredible capacity for self-correction, which you don't see in most of the European countries that I know.
Great, thank you. Did you want to mention anything about that?
I'm a little more pessimistic about the American elite, if not America itself necessarily. I agree that you have a sort of spate of books about American decline every time the United States goes through a recession and some other world power seems to be growing faster than we are, and so on. And I grew up in the early 1990s during the sort of Japan paranoia phase that Matthew referenced. And I remember, my dad reading Michael Crichton's novel Rising Sun, which some of you may have read, and being like, they own Rockefeller Center. What are we going to do? So I agree that it's important to take these kind of anxieties about American decline with a grain of salt. That being said, I don't think anyone can deny that there is a particular set of challenges that the United States faces right now. The sort of multi-tiered challenges where you have sort of a basic economic challenge of the worst recession in a long time, with layered on top of that a huge fiscal challenge of large budget deficits today and enormous ones tomorrow, and then the sort of ordinary crises of American foreign policy and domestic policy and everything else at the same time. And I don't think it's unreasonable to see, all Americans are responsible for the mess that we're in, right? If you look at something like the housing bubble, the housing bubble exists because people were reckless on Wall Street, it exists because people were reckless in Washington, and it exists because individual homebuyers were reckless, in their own lives and wanted, they wanted cheap mortgages and they didn't want to know where they came from, and here we are today. The only thing I'd say, though, is that there is that sort of, to those who have great power have great responsibility thing, where, the person in Wall Street or Washington who played a role in the inflating of the mortgage bubble is, in the end, more responsible for what happened than the person who's, was making a personal decision about a personal purchase that, affected him and his family, and he had no reason to think, when you buy a house, nobody expects you to consider the ramifications for the American economy as a whole. But if you work for Lehman Brothers, I think, or if you run Lehman Brothers, I think you're in a slightly different position. So in that sense, I do think that it's reasonable to sort of, for the American elite to bear a significant share of the criticism for some of the straits that we find ourselves in today.
Thank you very much.
Can I just make one small point in response to Ryan? I agree, obviously, we have tremendous problems here. I think, in the sense that American society has always worked, it's because there is such of accountability. And one of the unfortunate things that happened with the bailouts of Wall Street, you didn't have that carry through, although I think Dick Fold from Lehman is probably, not a happy man still these days and hasn't come out of this very well. I do, though, want to sort of defend a little bit, it's very popular to say that, we have terrible schools and our kids just can't keep up with the Chinese and science and math and with the Finns and all this. I think there is something that one should appreciate about the way that our elites are formed or people are educated generally in this country, is that I was thinking of this Czesław Miłosz, this Polish poet, once talking about how what he really appreciated about Americans, that he came to live here in exile for 4 years in Berkeley, that Americans actually listen and they're open to changing their minds. And he thought that this comes from, one, this is actually, you don't find as often, and I'm a European, so I can say whatever I want about Europeans. I don't think you find this often about Europeans. And I think this comes from American schools that, fine, are not the greatest at teaching you how to test properly on an international math test, but generally teach you how to be open-minded, again, what sort of, Martin Luther King was saying about closed-mindedness, to be open-minded, to be flexible. And I think that's a sort of an inner strength in this system that is worth acknowledging sometimes.
And in that vein, some of these comparisons that get made, to how we're falling behind the Chinese in math or the Finns and everything are not, they're not apples to apples comparisons. I mean, comparing Finland to the United States is like comparing Vermont to the United States. And half the time in these stories about, amazing Chinese performance, it turns out to be amazing Chinese performance at 100 schools in Shanghai. And it's like, well, if we took the top 100 schools in New York, the U.S. would look pretty good. So I agree with Matthew on that front to some extent.
No, and I find interesting what you said. One way of understanding what you said is that there is something inherent in an American education that sees reality as something positive, to which I can be open and kind of, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, kids like school usually in the U.S., which I think is probably a good thing.
So moving on to the online generation. I was interested in that piece already mentioned that you wrote on Congressman Weiner, because you identified the problem not so much in the technology, but in the narcissism that powered his and many others' use of technology. From this point of view, it seems to me that you were highlighting the meaning of the relationships we have with other human beings. In his particular case, and others, that, as you mentioned in that article, in this case, the others exist to tell me how big I am, you said. If I understood you correctly, and it seems to me the...
I don't know if I used exactly that. Maybe did I use exactly that phrase?
I believe you did.
I don't know how to publish.
But anyways, just to go on, so if I understand you correctly, it seems to me the key question isn't necessarily the technology, by means of which one is in relationship with others, but one's understanding of the meaning of the relationship with others. You see I'm harping on this, I'm not going to let this go. So we might identify the real problem as an education to the meaning of being in relationship with other people. Or would this statement be an oversimplification? Does the technology itself mediate our relationships to the point of a distortion that can never totally be tuned out, so to speak? What would you say?
I think it's too soon to tell. I think this is one of the most fascinating questions of our moment, you know, in education, but also just in human affairs more generally. Is we have spent, you know, basically 10 or 15 years living online. You know, older generations have been formed, educated in a pre-online era, and then are sort of living online. The generation below mine is the first generation to sort of come of age with the internet as a big part of their lives. And I think it's going to take a while for us to be able to tell, you know, is there something about this particular technology that has fundamental social effects on how human beings live, or, you know, is it like other technologies in the past where people say, well, you know, this is going to change what it means to be human, and, you know, it does to some extent, but ultimately the sort of same questions obtain. I mean, I think if I can go back to playing the declinist for a minute, there is a lot of very interesting and, again, very provisional data on sort of generational trends in things like narcissism. You know, there are these studies that sort of ask people to respond to questions, you know, sort of give yes or no answers to, I often try and imagine myself in my friend's shoes and see how the world looks from their point of view, yes or no, or I think of myself, or if I ran the world, it would be a better place, yes or no, you know, those kind of questions. And that's clearly a yes, obviously. But if you look at this sort of longitudinally, there is evidence that, you know, at least on these metrics, young Americans have maybe become a little more narcissistic and a little less empathetic than they used to be, and there is some correlation with the internet era, where some of these trends seem to accelerate in the era of first MySpace and then Facebook and so on. And you can see, I mean, again, it may turn out to be just sort of statistical noise that sort of declinist types like to fixate on and so on, but I think you can see a potential connection where, you know, anyone who's spent a lot of time on Facebook can see that it is a sort of a kind of unique platform for sort of constant self-fashioning and self-presentation, where your self is sort of held out at a remove from your own self and then sort of held up to other people and so on. So you can certainly see how these technologies could have some effect on, I think, people's psyches that go beyond just sort of, you know, that it's hard for us to escape, I guess you could say. But so that's sort of, that's some of the sort of interesting and perhaps alarming, I think, evidence that's out there. But
thank you. In a similar vein, I have a good friend who will speak here at the New York Encounter tomorrow from Egypt. I was telling you about him before. He was present in Tahrir Square during the protests that led to Hosni Mubarak's fall. And he personally gives tremendous credit to the Facebook page We Are All Khaled Said for originating the movement that led to such momentous events. Just to recap for the audience, that page was founded as a response to the brutal, retaliatory murder of an Egyptian blogger who dared post a video of an Egyptian policeman distributing drugs. On that Facebook page, with 600,000 plus members, from what I understand, a discussion ensued as to how to respond to his murder. And so some participants online on this Facebook page argued for the capture and murder of the officers responsible. Others argued for attacks upon every possible police station in Egypt. In the end, though, the decision that was made by this online community was to go to an officer on National Police Day in Egypt, which is a very large and important holiday in Egypt for reasons I'm not going to go into, and public holiday. And so they were to go to an officer on this holiday publicly and offer him a flower and tell him, "I am not your enemy," or something similar. Now, inasmuch as we can trust the details as recounted of this incident, does this show us a positive face of online relationships? Can something be learned about educational possibilities regarding social media from this?
I remember talking when I was in Cairo in spring, meeting one of the guys who organized the January 25th, which was the January 25th protest, which was the beginning of the Egyptian revolution. Some call it actually the Facebook revolution even. And he was saying, that they put this note out there that we're all going to meet. Anyone who cares to meet should come to this spot. We're going to do the march on the police day. I think that is January 25th. And he really had no idea how many people would respond. There were some checks, likes that people observed, but there was not that many. And he was actually telling me that he was very nervous the day of because they had no clue. And then people started gathering. He's like, okay, it's not so bad. And then he found himself being propelled by just the kind of mass of people behind him going forward. And he thought, oh my God, this is amazing, but what have we gotten ourselves into? I think that was, and this is the case as well in Tunisia, where it all started in the Arab Spring. These latest protests against Vladimir Putin and these fraudulent elections in December in Russia. This guy named Alexei Navalny and a couple of other young kind of bloggers, activists who really have been able to use the internet to essentially get around authoritarian governments that control the television airwaves. And so I think this is a real phenomenon. All that said, Facebook didn't create the revolutions in these countries. People created the revolutions. The idea, the notion that, revolutionary ideas go viral goes back centuries. There was apparently this rude poem about Louis XV that was sort of passed around in France. There's actually a book about this that I think came out earlier last year. A poem in I think 1749 that was had a very rude line about Louis XV, and the secret police in France at the time was trying to figure out who was passing this thing around, where did it originate, because that had gone viral. And you can make an argument that this was sort of one of the early steps that led to the French Revolution 40 years later. I mean, Facebook has made it obviously much easier to get the word out. Everything is faster in the world we live in now, mostly thanks to technology. But, this is not you need a society to come to a moment where it feels that it's ready to try and make a change. And in Egypt, it took many years. These technologies are just making that easier, but they're not. I don't think there's something revolutionary in and of themselves, and I don't think necessarily we're going to see a different world as a result. As with all kinds of media, radio, newspapers, the written word to begin with, going back to, I guess Socrates even, that there was that has changed because people can communicate, they can hold their rulers accountable. So I think that's all, obviously, if you believe in democracy, technology levels the political playing field and empowers a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be empowered. So this is all good. Your last question about education, I think in a funny way schools are holdout, or not a holdout, but kind of the last frontier for a lot of people who are interested in technology. There's this famous, I guess Steve Jobs, before he died, talked about how technology has changed everything we do except the way we teach our kids. That and this is just, we're at the beginning, first steps of how will the digital revolution change the classroom. I mean, the whole idea that there's a teacher, 25 kids or so, and the teacher is teaching every day and is following a class plan. That's the way it's always been. That's the way that it should be. And I think there's a lot of innovative thinking about how to introduce computers, not to replace the teacher, but to augment a good teacher, and also to minimize the harm that a bad teacher can do by giving kids in the classroom access to material or to teaching that kids in better schools already have. But we're really at a very early stage yet, and there are actually a lot of capitalists who are trying to figure out ways to profit from this, which I think is also healthy.
So, to sum up then, your response was that we're not so sure yet as to whether or not there are, so to speak, inherent negatives to the technology itself. And therefore, what I hear both of you saying is therefore there is a possibility for an education to use of these tools, and maybe even education by means of these tools.
Well, and to sort of to offer, I suppose, a sort of counterexample to my point. I mean, if you take the case of people in an authoritarian culture, right, a technology that in a society like the United States seems maybe to enable a kind of narcissism. In a society where people are accustomed to having a boot heel ground in their face, a little bit of narcissism might go a long way, right? I mean, seriously, like the famous, there's one of the famous images from I think it was Egypt, maybe somewhere else, someone holding up a sign saying, "I am a man," right? And to the extent that I think some of the aspects of sort of these personalized online technologies that seem maybe troubling in the American context might, again, this is very hypothetical, but might be beneficial in a less democratic context than their own. But in terms of education, I just think it's very, it's still very early. It's very hard to know. And I mean, one of the big challenges with education is just the extent to which it's all sort of interacts with family, neighborhood, and so on. That something like, there's tremendously innovative stuff that's done with distance learning and so on. But there is the danger too that the people who will benefit the most from sort of these breakthroughs will be people who are already benefiting from our educational system, and that people who come from a broken home or a bad neighborhood or something. It's breakthroughs in education that provide them with these resources might still be a poor substitute for for the best. I mean, you can, as you were saying, you can sort of. You can offer people things. When people have a bad teacher, the internet can offer them other options. But sometimes the role of the teacher, sometimes you just have to have that teacher to show them those options. And there, I think it becomes harder for sort of technological breakthroughs to substitute for good teachers.
And that brings me to my next question for you, which was right along those lines, because turning today, the figure of the teacher in some educational circles is the teacher presented as authoritative has become almost taboo. From this point of view, I was touched by your description of the day the Harvard course catalog arrived at your house. You wrote, "I remember vividly the moment in my high school senior year when Harvard's course catalog arrived in the mail. It was a doorstop of a book filled with descriptions of hundreds, maybe thousands of classes. I pored over it, asking myself how I could choose just 32 classes, 4 years worth, from the sea of fascinating choices." In that same piece, just a bit earlier, you wrote, as in a great library ravaged by a hurricane, the essential elements of a liberal arts education lie scattered everywhere at Harvard, waiting to be picked up. But little guidance is given on how to proceed with that task. Both your description of the catalog and the statement I just quoted seem to beg for an authoritative presence that can offer a sense to all of those scattered elements. Has the word authority been so tarnished as to be taboo in discussions on education? If so, how can we raise an issue that doesn't concern only undergraduates at Harvard, but many other educational institutions at many levels? For example, I have friends, I was talking about this moment right now with you, and indeed I have a brother who's a university professor, and they tell me that universities used to be administered by professors, but that slowly they're being replaced by a bureaucratic management class that has never been in a classroom, never had to do serious research or to seriously publish. So in this case, it seems to me that power starts to replace authority, bureaucratic power, you know what I mean?
Right, although, I mean, I would say that, you know, as much as again, I think this might be one of the places where the problems in American education are different at different levels. But I think what's striking to me about elite education is, as I said before, particularly in the humanities, I do think, yeah, there's a problem with the idea of authority, a problem with the idea of truth, and so on. But there's also just a problem that, you know, one of the reasons the teacher isn't an authoritative figure on Ivy League campuses is because Ivy League professors aren't hired to teach. They're hired to be, you know, hired to be famous in some cases, but they're hired to do research. And this is the idea of the modern research university, right? Is that teaching is in some sense secondary. And there it's less that the professor isn't clothed in enough authority than that, you know, he's just outsourcing his work to teaching fellows who don't, the professor has his authority, it's just that the people who are actually doing the teaching can't partake of it. But that, I think, is a different problem. I mean, and Matthew can speak to this better than I can. I think if you look at sort of school educational reform at the lower level, whether it's in New Orleans or New York or something, I think the focus, everybody's hopes right now are pinned on the teacher. The sort of the idea of, right, of sort of, if only we can get the right authority figures, meaning, you know, better teachers who presumably aren't protected by unions, who don't have the students' best interests at heart, and so on. That you know, this is the key that will unlock educational reform. So I think in that sense, you know, a lot of Americans involved in education reform are very invested right now in the authority of the right teachers, if you get the right teacher in the classroom. But I don't know what you think. I mean,
the debate for a long time, it was a debate very much dominated by unions, was that the most important thing was the teacher-student ratio. And coincidentally, the sort of unions benefited because if you got more teachers into the classrooms, you got more members paying dues, and you could sort of dish this money out to political candidates that you like, and have a stronger hand in protecting the jobs that you create. But the more recent, you know, research and, you know, this all goes one way or the other way, but it certainly is that what's not important, the class size is far less important than the quality of the teacher. I think even your colleague Nick Kristof had a column earlier this week about, you know, how your most important teacher in your life is your fourth grade teacher, you know, and there's a Harvard study since
in that case,
Harvard professors spent a lot of time doing research. There's a Harvard study that sort of even I think calculated by three economists that even calculated what you stand to gain or lose over a lifetime of work in terms of dollars earned from a bad or a good teacher that you had in fourth grade.
So, Mr. Kaminsky, then, this is my last question to you. I've often dreamed, we might say fantasized, of writing a book entitled Non-Commodities in a Free Market Culture. Note I'm questioning you from the Wall Street Journal on this.
I think you need a title. That can be after the colon. You need some, you know, a hot title to sell the subtitle.
Well, and the colon is then going to be Education, Politics, and Healthcare. The fundamental argument of my book would be that by nature, education, politics, and healthcare are non-commodities, something like love. They cannot be bought and sold. Indeed, when they are treated as commodities, they morph into something else. like love treated as a commodity morphs into prostitution. I'm not sure how well received my book would be in a culture where the market is often touted as the solution to the need for educational reform. What do you think of my thesis? Do you think that there's something about education that can never really be bought or sold? And independently of that question, what do you think more competition can offer to the world of education?
It's almost like a setup for a Wall Street Journal editorial writer.
Can you tell thought the question out for you?
With the exception of love, I think, competition is wonderful, and the more of it better, both for healthcare, frankly, and for education. And certainly for education, I think sort of the whole, what's not been fully, I think, recognized in the past 20 years is this incredible movement in this country that you can say started with the founding of Teach for America by Wendy Copps in the early 90s, that you had, being a school teacher before then was considered to be, if you didn't do very well in school or if you wanted an easy job, you became a teacher. And
I'm a teacher, and the phrase is, when you can't do, you teach.
But I think there has been a change of, I think the Teach for America probably gets too much credit for this, but it's definitely been kind of social change of the perception of teaching, not just university, but also sort of especially lower down. And, a lot of people have gone and went into these schools in the early 90s from, having done very well in school themselves. And, they were going to do it for 2 or 3 years. And one, they really developed this passion for teaching, but also they came away horror-stricken with the state of our schools in this country, of our public schools. And the problem was not that we were not spending enough money on education, because we spend a lot of money on education, but that these people saw how ill-served the kids were by the education they were getting. And there's this is one of the few areas where you have the strangest bedfellows, where you have, both kind of bleeding heart liberals and very conservatives who really see eye to eye, who are part of the reform movement. And there's also been this backlash against it. It's been led by the unions and by some academics. But the reform movement basically comes around the idea of school choice and school competition. Some people go as far as to say, you should have vouchers, that taxpayers who have kids, if they're in a bad school district, should be allowed to get vouchers they can use to go to a private school. But I think the general idea more is that, some people say, well, you don't actually need to go that far, but if you can create schools where kids who are in bad school districts can choose to go to a better school, and if you open up this monopoly, and one of the more effective instruments has been the charter school movement, that you kind of allow outside operators to come in, start new schools, take over schools, and see if they can do better. Now, charters are not a panacea, and it's very easy to find bad charters. I don't think certainly all charters are not good schools, but the beauty of the charter school model is that you can much more easily close or change a charter operator than you can an existing public school that's run by entrenched principal and teachers who cannot be moved because they have tenure and they can't be fired or moved to another school. So I think that's where you've seen this dynamic of choice play out. I think it's been what people are discovering, that for many years the excuse was, well, these kids come from bad families. They come from poor families. This is why they do badly in school. But, when you go up to the Harlem Cess Academy, or if you go to some of these better schools, these better charter schools, the KIPP schools, taking the same kids who are being failed, who are at failing schools and failing themselves. And these are random pools. I mean, the only selection is that these kids have parents who choose to go through the lottery system to try and find a space in these schools. These are essentially the same kids. And if you haven't seen, there's 2 great movies about this, 2 great documentaries. One is called The Lottery, that came out last year, which is just about Harlem. And the other one was pretty well known, Waiting for Superman, that with its sort of schools in various cities. And they're quite moving. These people actually And the critical figure here is the mother. If you have an active mother, the mother wants the best for their kids and is the one trying to get them to these schools. So again, you have the same kids who, lo and behold, can do well, can test well, can learn their math, read at a high level, and that's the result, honestly, of introducing competition into a very, what was a pretty stagnant public education system.
Thank you. Did you want to?
I have a very short, which is that I think it's possible to say that certain goods are goods that cannot be distributed purely through the market, without saying that you can't have competition and choice. So the examples you cite, healthcare and education, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that those are areas where it makes sense to have some kind of public provision. But having a public provision doesn't then mean that you should take the next step and say, while we have this public provision, we won't have any competition or choice between, we have a public provision and you have to take it. I mean, that doesn't seem like it's going to lead to good outcomes. And I would also say, given that my wife was dating a man other than myself when I first met her, I believe in competition and love as well. So it's not necessarily an either or.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, what am I going to say after that one? No, I was just thinking that what had led to that reflection was I was thinking, of course, I don't know, of course or not, but I was thinking of Socrates, and I was thinking.
I was as well.
I was thinking of Socrates, and I was thinking, can you pay for what he does? I mean, in that sense, the question arises. In other words, there's a human being who has a position in front of reality, and for whom to educate is to walk out into reality the people he meets, into the reality in which he dwells, right? And it's in that sense that my question arises. In other words, is there ultimately something about education, good education, real education, that cannot be programmed? It's in this sense that my question, and I think that your answers were great and everything, but it's this sense that is there something about a good education that is closer to a chance event, closer to going out for a day golfing and you get great weather, closer to that than there is that you plan every detail out and assure consumers of a product at the end of the line. It's in that sense that the question was raised.
But I think demanding consumers have been my father was a university professor, says that his kids, they know how much they pay in tuition to come here and talk twice a week. And they want him to do a good job. If he doesn't do a good job, he's going to hear about it. Oh, yeah. And I think in that sense, this feeling of accountability, and he had come from a European university, and that was one of the first things that he noticed. And people sort of expect something because they are paying for it. Again, I think tuition costs are completely out of control, especially as I'm thinking about sending my own kids through school. This is in this way the market works. And the degree that education is a chance event, I'm not sure. I think, education is a lifetime event, and it doesn't stop because we go to certain institutions. I think we can learn from bad teachers as much as from good teachers, and hopefully you're creating engaged, open-minded, critically thinking citizens who, go through these schools, but also go through life in a similar way, holding people accountable.
And there's also the sort of democratic, what you're talking about are sort of democratic versus aristocratic concepts of education in a sense, right? If we want to, bring in Tocqueville for a minute, you could say that yes, the American educational system tends to, be perhaps, there are virtues and goals of education that are less likely to be met by the necessities of sort of mass education in a mass democracy with a large, necessarily bureaucratic public school system. Things that you're not going to deliver to every student, what Aristotle could deliver to Alexander. I mean, right? It's a joke, but there is a sense in which there is a kind of education that is, that perhaps the absolute best form of education is detached from some of these sort of, the grubby necessities of getting ahead and so on. But at the same time, that model of education, Socrates' model of education, was a model that was explicitly for the few rather than the many. And so there is a sense in which, if we believe that education is for the many as well, we need to keep that aristocratic ideal in mind, but we also have to accept that there will be, the grubbiness of, no child left behind, testing mandates, right, along the way or something. I mean, or maybe it's not no child left behind, but there is, we both have to not lose sight of the aristocratic goals, but also not sort of turn up our noses at, the sort of more basic, sometimes workmanlike side of a democratic education.
No, and I certainly would not argue against that in the sense that clearly there are basic skills that need to be communicated.
I mean, Socrates would not have accepted me as a pupil. I think that goes without saying, right? Well, or any of us in this room, right? I mean, there's that sort of, everybody. If everybody deserves an education, then sort of. You have to condescend as well as elevate, you might say.
No, and again, just to finish up, my principal interest is that, again, as a person who meets people every day in the classroom, and who sees the results of an education that is offered more or less the common understanding for the students that I meet and deal with. The common understanding is that they're there for success, but success in the future can be very weak for many people as a motivator to actually be engaged, and so the question is perhaps an educational proposal that goes deeper might actually draw in more people than accepting that we'll have perhaps a two-tier system where we give a lower education to kind of a basic education to a certain group and another education to a higher group. But again, what's great about what we're doing here is that we open these questions, and the reason that we invited you is because you're people who are not only in the discussion, but you drive the discussion. You drive the discussion in our society. You help us, you really lead us in what we're going to talk about. And so the opportunity to be with you is the opportunity to be with people who engage other people in the discussion and say, these are issues that we would like to see in the discussion. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if there are announcements that I'm supposed to... Oh, there he is.